ندعو الآن الدكتور عصام قريشي لتقديم ومناقشة ورقة عمل QMP Capital، فليتفضل مشكورا.
Ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum and good morning. QMB Capital are delighted to be one of the sponsors of today's event, and we very much support the initiatives of GOIC and are proud to participate in conferences such as these, which clearly are mutually beneficial for all of the GCC countries and the participants within those. I'm one of the directors at QNB Capital. QNB Capital is the investment banking arm of QNB, Bank Qatar Al Watani. We're responsible for a variety of investment banking activities, and I'll come on to those towards the end of my presentation. In terms of my background, I've been in the Middle East for just over 3 years. Prior to that, I was working for an investment bank in Europe, where I was in their healthcare team, responsible for listing biotechnology and healthcare companies on European and US stock markets, and also for assisting them in raising capital. Prior to that, I trained as a corporate and commercial lawyer in London, where I advised healthcare companies, both large and biotechnology companies, in terms of clinical trial agreements, manufacturing agreements, distribution agreements, and manufacturing capabilities. Prior to that, I trained as a cardiologist, so I've got a bit of a background in healthcare. I know that a lot of our friends have already spoken about the sector in quite a lot of detail. I'm just going to touch upon some of those key points purely to reiterate some of the key issues that we need to be conscious of. The first thing, I don't think anyone's in any doubt the pharmaceutical industry is extremely valuable. We're talking about an industry which is growing at a compound annual growth rate of around 5 to 7%. That represents almost $900 billion worth of value. And bear in mind, I'm only talking about pharmaceuticals, so this excludes things like medical devices and other technology applications. Most of this growth and revenue is driven by US, Europe, and Asia and Japan. However, over the last couple of years, we're seeing that emerging markets such as India, China, Brazil are becoming very significant players in this industry. And if we compare the growth of those players, it's almost 4 to 5-fold greater than developed markets. So clearly there is space for them in the industry. What are some of the issues that are affecting the R&D industry? I think the biggest issue is pipeline. The number of patents that are expiring for drugs, initiatives to create new compounds is becoming more limited, and that's resulting in increased M&A activity in the pharmaceutical space. So the large players in Western markets are now looking at acquisitions of smaller biotechnology companies. The other thing is regulators are becoming more stringent. The approval process is becoming more difficult, thereby potentially hindering new players into the market. Some of my colleagues have already given details about patent expiry, and the number of patents which are expiring in the next 4 years is worth approximately 80 billion worth of sales. That's important because that obviously represents a market which can be captured by generic manufacturers. I think the final issue to highlight on this is lifestyle diseases are particularly prevalent in the Middle East. And here I'm talking about things like diabetes, smoking-related disorders, and obesity. If we look at the GCC pharma sector, it represents an absolutely tiny proportion of the global sector, less than 1%. However, this is still a sizable market worth about $5.5 billion and is estimated to double by 2020. However, growth in this sector is going to continue, driven by a number of factors, primarily population, an increase in the number of elderly. So currently we expect that number to double within the next 9 years. And as I've already mentioned, lifestyle diseases. There's also been some initiatives from some of the GCC governments. So there are requirements, for example, to maintain insurance for expatriate workers. Such initiatives are helpful to the pharma industry because they actually help develop the size of the market. And if we use Saudi as an example, we saw that a few years ago, the requirement to maintain health insurance for expatriate workers was in relation to large companies. And over the course of the last few years, that requirement has decreased so that companies with smaller number of expatriate employees are also required to maintain health insurance. If we look at the proportion of drugs that are imported in the region, that currently is around 80%, which represents over $1 billion. If we can develop the capability within the GCC to manufacture our own drugs, there's certainly potential for us to capture a large proportion of that market. The majority of the drugs that are imported into the GCC are indeed patented, and healthcare spend within the GCC is on the increase. So currently 7 to 12% of GCC annual budgets are dedicated to healthcare spending. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but what I've just got up here is some of the country profiles of some of the GCC countries. I think the key thing to highlight on these slides is Saudi Arabia represents the largest market player, approximately 51% of the market, followed by UAE. Even some of the smaller GCC countries, as we've just heard, have got some fantastic manufacturing facilities, such as in Oman. What are some of the challenges that we're facing? Why is our industry struggling in this region? Or why haven't we capitalized on the opportunities sufficiently? Medicines in the GCC are very expensive. So certain drugs are 10 times the price they would be in Western markets. This represents an opportunity for local players that needs to be capitalized upon. Unevenly priced medicines creates the opportunity for pricing arbitrage. In Europe a few years ago, we had a number of cases of parallel imports where drugs manufactured by the same company could be bought cheaper in countries such as Greece, Spain, Portugal, and were then imported to countries such as the UK. Again, a harmonization across GCC governments in terms of pricing would help alleviate some of these problems. One of the key issues that we're facing is manufacturing of pharmaceuticals is extremely expensive, and I'll come on to some of the financing issues that we face in the sector. R&D investment in the GCC is very low compared to developed nations. It goes without saying that the R&D time to manufacture a drug has been decreasing over the last 20, 30 years. Maybe 30 years ago, the time to manufacture a drug was about 20 years to go through preclinical and then clinical studies. Now we currently stand at 6 to 8 years, and the cost of R&D for a single patented product is probably 6 to 8 years. And again, as technology improves, improved manpower and capabilities, that time is decreasing. However, there are problems. We're seeing an increased number of counterfeit drugs in the markets, and trying to get hold of the perpetrators of these crimes is actually difficult. Actually being able to monitor the influx of these imported drugs into the GCC is also proving problematic. GCC, I believe it is the land of opportunities, just for some of the reasons I've outlined earlier. Some of the reasons for that are spending on healthcare is increasing significantly. As the GCC economies move away from hydrocarbon-based economies, there's an increased focus on education and R&D. And just some of the initiatives undertaken by various countries include Sidra Medical Research Centre, Dubai Healthcare City, King Abdullah Medical Centre, Qatar Science and Technology Park. Such initiatives from individual countries and collectively as GCC countries are very helpful in moving forwards. There's also a lack of listed entities on GCC stock markets. If we want to attract investors, we need to show them that there's potential returns, there's profitability in these businesses. And I'll come on to some of those factors in a few moments.